We got a Blue Jackets-centered episode today, including talk about Adam Fantilli, and then Jay Forster of Locked On Blue Jackets hops on with Sebastian in order to talk about Denton, Mateychuk, and Stanislav Svozil, all coming up on today's episode of Locked On NHL Prospects.
You are Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, and welcome back to Locked On NHL Prospects, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. On this podcast, we break down everything prospects related for you 5 days a week, Monday to Friday. I'm Mateychuk, joined by Sebastian. Hi. We've got a Columbus Blue Jackets-centered episode for you today. First and foremost, we'll talk about Adam Fantilli. He got lit up in preseason by TJ Oshie. We'll talk about what adaptations are required in this game to really kind of gel to an NHL lineup and do a great job in the top six. And then Jay Forster of Locked On Blue Jackets will hop on for the next two segments. After that, we'll talk first and foremost with Jay about Denton, Mateychuk. Then we'll end things off with talk about Stanislav, Svozil, two defensemen in the Blue Jacket system. Before we get into any of that, first and foremost, this episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. New customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets. Guaranteed. Now visit fanduel.com/lockedon to get started. And also, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. Leave us a comment letting us know what you want us to talk about next. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, whether that's Spotify, Odyssey, Apple Podcasts, whatever it is, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. It's always very much appreciated. So let's get right into it with Adam Fantilli here. He got absolutely lit up by TJ Oshie. I think it was in the game against the Washington Capitals. I think even Adam Fantilli tried to reverse hit TJ Oshie and learned very quickly that there's such a thing as dad strength. So yeah, that did not go well for Fantilli. Ended up on his butt. It was really a fantastic hit by TJ Oshie. But yeah, it started to make me think, this is the type of situation that Fantilli's going to see often as a bigger, more physical player who's, going to be carrying the puck a lot, who's going to be going in corners a lot. What adaptations would you see in Fantilli's game that could kind of prevent this kind of thing from happening? Because if this is happening on a regular basis, as we saw with Uri Slafkovsky in his draft year, it's just a matter of time before he gets injured, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a case for a lot of 18-year-olds that come into the NHL where some specific professional habits represent the biggest hurdles. And I think with Slafkovsky was very, very, very clearly the scanning habits that were a glaring issue as a rookie. Yeah. And it was quite clear also going in, like in his draft year, actually, like before he even was drafted by the Habs, that was something that he had to work on. With Fantilli, I never thought that scanning was a big issue for him at the NCAA level. But the NHL is a different beast. And with the pace of play, with the lack of space and time, you have to be a really high-end pre-scanner to avoid getting hit and lit up like that, especially if you're playing top 6 minutes. Like, Fantilli is likely going to get a fair amount of ice time this season, which means he's going to be playing against good competition. And that means that's going to be players that will not be giving him any space or time. And that was quite clear here. I mean, it was the last preseason game, which is always the one game where you see extra tenacity on both sides, no matter what type of lineup it is. And Fantilli got really lit up. It was a true welcome to the NHL moment, despite it not even being NHL regular season just yet. And I thought that it represented, again, an issue that a lot of young players have in terms of thinking they have a lot more time just because they're used to having more time, right? It's just a habit that he has to learn. And he post-scanned on that time. And that was not enough because TJ Oshie came in really, really quickly. And in order to be a dynamic difference maker with the puck on the stick, Fantilli is going to have to pretty quickly learn to scan at an NHL level, which I don't think is going to take him too long. His hockey sense is one of his strengths. He picks up habits pretty quickly, and I don't think it's going to be as big of an adapting period as it was with Slafkovsky, for instance. But definitely he got his bells rung, and definitely a wake-up call.
Yeah, for sure. We love those welcome to the NHL moments. We saw it with Connor Bedard as well in the shootout. There was a specific shootout that he took against Marc-Andre Fleury. where it was a deke too much, and he ended up on his rear. And the puck didn't go in, and he's just sitting on the ice, kind of contemplating life. And Marc-Andre Fleury just skates up, gives him a little tap on the back with the stick, like, "Don't worry, kid, you'll get him next time." We love those moments, and I think that there's a lot of lessons to be learned here for Fantilli. But what's really promising for me with Fantilli is, first and foremost, the situation is, and obviously in Columbus. I mean, there's not as much competition as center as you could wish. I mean, Patrick Laine was playing first line center at one point in last year. Other than Cole Sillinger, maybe Kent Johnson, I don't see much competition there, and they're all young players. So it's just who's the better of the three. It's not like experience takes priority there, especially the year that Sillinger had last year, and especially with Kent Johnson just barely getting started. It's going to be interesting to kind of see them develop. But for me with Fantilli, you're looking at a player who has all the makings of a top six player. I mean, I'd be extremely, extremely shocked if he doesn't at the very least become a second line center. I think that's his floor. But I also think the ceiling's sky high with him, and he can develop into something very interesting. But yeah, I mean, the scanning habit's never been an issue. It's just, obviously, it's a new league with new parameters, with a new pace of play. It's different. It's a completely different ballgame than the NCAA, and he's still 18. So there's a lot of time to kind of develop that and learn the ins and outs of how to play good NHL hockey. But Fantilli has all the individual tools. They just have to come together. So I'm really particularly interested in what your projection is for him this season. Are we talking about half a point a game, less than that? What do you see as a realistic kind of possibility for Fantilli in terms of point totals this year?
I think with Fantilli, it really, really, really hinges on who he's playing with. If he's given minutes with Laine and Gaudreau, he's going to put up a decent amount of points.
Yeah.
But if he's not, I think it might be a little bit slower. He's not as refined as other draft eligibles are. So like Connor Bedard and Leo Carlson, I think, are more NHL ready in terms of the style that they play than Fantilli is. Even Zach Benson, I think, is more NHL ready than Fantilli is in terms of how he approaches the game. Yeah. And while I'm a little bit surprised that that Benson has taken the opportunity and run in the way that he has, and that he's been given every opportunity possible to show his abilities, Fantilli, I think, will need a bit more time to adapt. So I think that, honestly, I don't think that at the offensive production is really going to be what defines Fantilli's rookie season. I think it's going to be really about the growing pains and the overall learning the professional habits of the game. But one more question I have for you is, if you were on the bench, like as like a coach for Columbus, after Fantilli skated back slowly from after that hit, what would your advice to him be? Like, would you just be trying to encourage him, or would you give him like specific tips in order to avoid that situation in the future?
I'd honestly just tell him, like, this is going to happen, and do you want to know how to prevent it? Just take a look before you get the puck. That's all you have to do, and you're able to sidestep that hit or make a play around it, and you're fine. But I would hammer home the fact that this is an avoidable situation if you take a look before you get the puck, unless it's not, in which case it's either charging, interference, or it's a good play by the opposing player and there's nothing you can do. That would kind of be my approach to it, especially with a player who's probably never had to face a situation like this so far. I mean, he's a big guy. He's always played above his age group. He's always been stronger than most of his opponents. Like, this is probably new territory for him. It's just letting him know that this is going to happen. It's reality of the NHL. And if you want to take as if you want to have the best chances possible of not having this happen again, just take a look before you get the puck. That's what I'd recommend. But who am I to say? I'm not an NHL coach. So we'll see how it goes. Do you have anything else that you'd say differently, or?
Not really. I think I would have said something very similar. I think scanning is really a big thing there. But I also think I'd be curious if Columbus worked with Fantilli in terms of learning to reverse hit, because he's a build of player that could be very, very effective in reverse hits and kind of just like absorbing that contact rather than having to sidestep it. And I think that teaching him multiple ways of solving that problem, whether it be with his handling, with a quick pass, with a sidestep, or with a reverse hit, I think he could do any of those really, really well. So I think if I were on the bench, I'd encourage him to think of all the different ways that he could have solved that problem. And if he would have taken a look at first, he would have had multiple tools at his disposal to solve that. And
Yeah.
he had probably half a second or a full second to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely within the possibility with Fantilli's processing speed to find a really good solution to that problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like a lot of the best coaches will do that. They'll just show the player the clip and say, how would you have done that differently? How would you have prevented that from happening?"
Yeah.
And I feel like that's a very useful development tool that a lot of coaches could utilize a bit more, because just shouting instructions at your players doesn't always work. You might need to do that in the playoffs, but preseason, just let him solve it out. But that wraps things up for first segment. And we got two segments coming up with Jay Forster of Locked On Blue Jackets. First, we'll head into the segment here regarding Denton, Mateychuk, some talk with Sebastian about that. That's coming up on today's episode of Locked On NHL Prospects.
Snap into action this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets, guaranteed, when you place a $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose, that you can use on anything, ranging from spreads to player props to over and unders and far more. There's really no better time to join FanDuel than right now, so get in on the action. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL.
Let's start off with the big guy. I want to talk about Denton Mateychuk, because he's a guy that has played in a handful of preseason games so far. And every single time I feel like people are saying, he looks NHL ready. He looks NHL ready. They haven't sent him back to Moose Jaw yet. Obviously, CHL training camps kicked off, and I believe the preseason is happening kind of as we record this. But I wanted to kind of get your take on it, because I know Mateychuk was kind of a reach for the Blue Jackets at 12th overall last year, but how do you feel about his ceiling, his potential? What's your read on how he's gonna do when he finally does turn pro?
I was a pretty big fan of Mateychuk. I think I had him ranked 8th or 9th overall that year, so he wouldn't have been a reach that much on my board. I think a year later on, he would probably fall down closer to that 15 range on my board in a re-ranking. But I think that he's been progressing quite nicely. It's really just that other guys have leapfrogged him. Like players like Lane Hutson, for instance, would have surpassed him on my board at this point in time. But I think he's developing really quite nicely. With Mateychuk, you're getting a player who is really, really intelligent and super aggressive in the offensive zone. There are very few players that are more natural activators from the blue line, or who are more aggressive in terms of activating and pinching up into the offensive zone than Denton Mateychuk. He's a very, very modern defenseman whose game is built on his intelligence, his skill, and his aggression. In the defensive zone, he's pretty standard. He's not necessarily the most stand-out defenseman that will catch your eye on every defensive shift, but he's really intelligent with how he positions himself. He's a very unique style of player because he plays this kind of Rambo-style offense, but backs it up with some pretty solid defensive play that's a lot more subtle in his own zone. And the big question with him is whether the skating can really catch up to the speed of his brain in order to kind of ease that road for him to the NHL to be able to execute these really high-end plays that he's able to do versus junior competition against the best players in the world. So I think that I can see why fans are always very excited in terms of the high-end prospects coming in and making the lineup right from the start. But I mean, Columbus already has guys like David Jiricek that I think are going to be more active pushers for big NHL roles this season than Denton Mateychuk. Mateychuk was a player that a lot of people in the scouting community were a little bit skeptical on as a draft eligible, just because of how unique of a profile he is. And that's why some people thought he was a reach at 12th overall, because he's a bit of a big swing on upside. The floor is not the highest here. And it's also one of the reasons that I would personally quite like to see him get an entire season in the AHL, just to refine his game, just to adapt to pro competition, because this is not a player who's going to outskate or muscle many players in the professional game. And when you don't have either of those two tools that are really an advantage when you're entering the professional level, it can be a bit tough to adapt. And Mateychuk's going to have to learn that, but he's so intelligent. And I'm not really very concerned of him failing to adapt to professional hockey. I just think it's going to take him some time. And I mean, look, if he's able to impress everyone from the get-go in training camp, I've not really been able to watch him much in training camp this year. But if he's able to do that and crack the lineup from the get-go, that's awesome. But I don't think the expectation should be for him to play an extended amount of NHL minutes this season, just because he's a pretty raw player still, especially in terms of how his tools support his overall style. But he's a ton of fun, and I love that Columbus picked him. I think going with him and Jiricek was absolute chaos at the draft in 2022, and I think it's going to go very nicely. This is a great piece. The other thing is, though, Columbus has like 8 defensemen already, and I can't say I overly understood this summer strategy of going out and acquiring 2 pretty big name top 4 defensemen. You can make your arguments about Ivan Provorov, whether he's actually a top 4 defenseman in terms of ability or not, but he's going to get top 4 minutes. And to me, it seemed like there was such a clear turning of a page. With Jiricek and Mateychuk coming in. Same thing with another player we're going to talk about, Stanislav Svozil. But there aren't really these openings for these players to just take off. And I'd much rather see Denton Mateychuk get 20 minutes a night in the AHL and get stunted into a 7th defenseman role in Columbus.
Yeah, 100%. I've kind of been banging the drum on Locked On Blue Jackets for a while now that I don't think you can really overdevelop a defenseman, especially when
they take time.
I believe he's still only 19 years old.
Yeah.
So he's not eligible for the AHL. He's going to be going back to the WHL if he doesn't make the NHL this season.
It's always unfortunate. There's so many prospects where the AHL is like the perfect fit logistically, and it's like, yes, the CHL NHL agreement comes in and buds in and makes everyone's lives miserable because I'm with you. I don't think Mateychuk has very much to learn in Moose Jaw for another season, but the AHL would be ideal. That's unfortunate. They didn't hit the age cutoff for that. That sucks.
So that kind of is my next question. Is obviously there's been a lot of talk about Shane Wright getting this waiver to play in the AHL if he doesn't make the NHL. And there's been a couple of guys on Columbus that people are saying, Jarmo Kekalainen might reach out and try to get waivers for Jordan Dumais or Denton Mateychuk. And I was kind of on the boat of send Mateychuk back to juniors. If you have to pick one of them to play in the AHL, I would pick Dumais. Is that kind of where you fall as well? Do you think Dumais could benefit from AHL? Or do you think, like, if you had to pick one, which player would you put in the AHL and which would you send back to juniors?
I'm still definitely a lot higher on Mateychuk than I am on Dumais. I still have a lot of questions with Dumais. But if there's any player that's proven that he's, like, grown out of the CHL, it's Jordan Dumais. Like, I still have a ton of questions on how good he's going to be in the NHL, the hurdles he's going to face on his road to being an impactful player. That's still very murky in my eyes. But he has nothing left to learn in the queue. Like, there's nothing that he can learn there. He's maxed out in that league. And I think with him, you can make a pretty solid argument as well if you're Jarmo Kekalainen to get him out of the queue, right? You can just, like, point to the point totals and you'd be done with it. With Mateychuk, it'd be a lot more difficult to make the same argument that Seattle made for Shane Wright. So I think if one of the two, yes, Dumais, just because another season in the queue would basically just be a flat line for his development, and that could be the end of the line for him in my eyes. Like, I think he needs, like, if any player in the Columbus system needs a jump in competition, it is Jordan Dumais. So yeah, I'm with you on that one.
Yeah, we've had a lot of people like, because he scored 140 points in the queue this year, which is nonsense, just completely bananas point totals. A lot of people are saying, well, he's NHL ready, and I don't necessarily agree with that. But to get back to Mateychuk, because otherwise we will talk all day about Dumais as well. The way I see it is, I assume he's going to go back to the WHL. And then he's probably going to do what Stanislav Svozil did last season, which is get a couple of NHL games at the end of this season when Moose Jaw's season is over, and then kind of go from there. But in the future, how do you feel about a Jiricek Mateychuk top pairing for the Blue Jackets? Because I feel pretty good about that.
That'd be chaos. I don't. Ooh. Stylistically, it's not a bad fit. I don't know if I feel comfortable projecting Mateychuk as a number 2. I think at this point, I'd feel a little bit more comfortable with him as a number 3. I think if you have a second pairing of Svozil and Mateychuk, you are doing really nicely for yourself. And both of those players have played extended shifts on their offside, so both can play on the right if they need to. And I'm not sure if Mateychuk can leapfrog Zach Werenski in that depth chart. That's kind of my big question here. I think that a Werenski and a Jiricek top pairing is perhaps a little bit more likely if you're looking at Columbus. But there's definitely still that like the Mateychuk's upside still extends to that number 2 like defenseman slot in my eyes. It's more just I think Werenski's already there, and the likelihood that Mateychuk hits that is maybe like a 15-20% in terms of likelihood that he is like that bona fide top pairing guy. And when you're picking 12th overall, you're not really expecting to get a top pairing defenseman out of that draft pick. So I think number 3 is kind of what the expectation internally in Columbus is for him. And that's also kind of where I feel most comfortable landing with him, where he's kind of like your number 3, but maybe your number 2 offensive defenseman, right? Like he gets those second power play minutes for sure. But at 5-on-5, that's a little bit more of a toss up in my eyes, but it's still a possibility for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I'd rather have guys that are maybe play. So, like, I'd rather have a guy that is a really good third defenseman instead of a guy, that same person, playing as a not very good second defenseman.
Exactly.
Number 2, if that makes sense. I'd rather have them overachieving than underachieving.
Yeah.
Because I've just had an entire season of watching the Blue Jackets defensemen like just play above their station because Werenski went down 13 games.
Everyone.
And then it got worse from there, you know? I mean, shout out to number 1 defenseman Andrew Peeke for large parts of this NHL season.
I thought you were going to say like Marcus Bjork or Tim Burney or something. You had so many names in there that were logging pretty big minutes for large portions of the season.
Yeah, I mean, it was real.
Wasn't Bjork on like the first power play for like 20 games or something?
Yep.
Yeah.
It wasn't
ideal. Yeah.
it was such a time to be a Blue Jackets fan.
All right, so that was Denton, Jay Forster and Sebastian High regarding Denton Mateychuk. Now we're going to move on to our final segment where they talk a bit more about Stanislav Svozil. In my opinion, probably the best prospect in the Columbus Blue Jackets defensive pool. That's coming up on today's episode of Locked On NHL Prospects.
The NHL season is finally here, and that's why I want to tell you about Sleeper. Sleeper is my go-to platform for daily fantasy sports and especially daily fantasy hockey. With Sleeper, you have a chance to win 100 times your cash on daily fantasy. The NHL has never been more exciting than it is right now, with stars ranging from Sidney Crosby to Connor McDavid and NHL rookie Connor Bedard. Simply select, more or less based on their stats and their projections for the season, a team that you think will do the strongest. Sleeper offers 100 times payouts, so start paying attention, make the right picks, and you could win big. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details.
But I want to talk about someone that we just talked a little bit about, actually, and that's someone that I'm really high on in this organization. And right up until they took Jiricek and Mateychuk, this guy was like, okay, this is my favorite defense prospect. I want to talk about Stanislav Svozil, who had just an absolute monster world juniors, just gone. Played in the NHL, made his NHL debut at the end of last season, had a monster season in the WHL, playing with some guy named Connor Bedard, if you've heard of him. How do you see Svozil finding a path to the NHL? Because we talked about it a little bit in the last segment about Mateychuk, it's kind of clogged. The NHL path is at the minute. And so I'm looking at Stanislav Svozil, who in my mind is another option for a potential NHL spot, but he's got to beat out like 6 guys to get there. So where do you see Svozil kind of falling this season?
Svozil is the one defenseman in Columbus's depth chart who, in my mind, is a candidate of being like way too good to like lose to the development curse of just like staying in the AHL forever and just like not really panning out. I think he's too good to have that fate, but I don't know if there's space for him. So he might be the defenseman that gets moved in a trade of some sort just because there is no roster spot for him, unless injuries happen again, as they did last season, and then he's going to be playing top pair minutes before you know it. But Svozil's a player that I have been a big fan of for a really long time. Going back to his draft year, I had him ranked top 20. I was a really big fan of him in his draft year, and he was a pure defensive defenseman as a draft eligible. In his draft year, he's playing in Europe, and his U18 tournament wasn't the strongest, which led him to fall down draft boards. And I still would have picked him inside the first round, but he fell all the way to the third. And I mean, you guys got excellent value there. In the WHL, he really learned how to really layer a lot of offensive tools into an already solid defensive toolkit. So he was already a pretty strong skater. He was really good at matching the footwork against opposing forwards on the rush. And in the WHL, he learned to kind of use that to layer lateral mobility into his own puck rushes going up the ice. And he learned how to become a bit more deceptive and creative offensively. And as Connor Bedard became Connor Bedard before our eyes in the WHL, Svozil had the best teammate possible. He had a cheat code that he could play with consistently, and he used that. He was one of the few players in Regina that was consistently using the talent that is Connor Bedard to push his own game forward consistently, game to game. He was using that skill that he had available to him to push himself, and it was great to see, and his stock skyrocketed afterwards. And he was really learning how to become a far stronger playmaker with that high-end talent that he was playing with. And he's still going to have that in Columbus. And he's going to have a ton of really high-skilled players to play off of. So he's a player that I'm a massive fan of. And I like every year at the draft, I have this thing where I basically jot down a note of the player that I would have drafted for a Montreal Canadiens draft slot. So going back to the 2020 draft. And Svozil was in that 2021 draft class for me. I would have picked him in the second round with one of the Habs draft picks, which they ended up using on like Luke Tuck, which wasn't the greatest pick. I'm happy with mine on that one with Howe's age. And he's only gotten significantly better since then. Like, he's a great transition defender. His defensive game is still really, really strong, and it's what he really built his draft stock on. But the fact that he's built such a strong offensive and transition game on top of that in the years since, it makes me so optimistic for his projection. I think he's going to be a really solid second pairing defenseman for a long time. I just don't know if that's going to be in Columbus or not.
Yeah. Is it? I feel like every time you see a player that has a really good season next to, so like I always think about how when in Connor McDavid's draft year, everyone was like Dylan Strome only got that many points because he was playing with McDavid, and I think the same thing happened with Alex DeBrincat. Already hearing about Gavin Brindley, how he's only got these goals because he was playing with Adam Fantilli, and you get the same thing with Svozil. Like, how I'm not worried that Svozil is just a product of Connor Bedard, but like, can you talk a little bit about that and kind of how, like, what part of his game makes you believe that he can be an extremely good player even when he's not passing to Bedard?
Yeah. I think so much of Svozil's value came from things that can't really be related to Connor Bedard. For instance, his transition defending was not that good because of Connor Bedard when he was already a draft eligible and wasn't even playing in North America yet. He has a lot of really, really awesome strengths. The production, sure. I'm not going to make an argument that I think that Svozil is going to be a 50-point a season defenseman in the NHL. That said, I think he has the potential to be a really, really, really solid two-way piece. I think before playing with Connor Bedard, he was stronger defensively than offensively, whereas now I wouldn't say that anymore. I think he's just as good at either end. He's become a true 200-foot defenseman, and that's not something that is really reliant on playing with a particular player. It'd be different if he were in my projection, a pure playmaking defenseman, where a lot of the value of his play comes from like his assist totals or his power play distribution, and where that's really like the crux of what makes a player valuable and projects as an impactful NHL piece for those reasons. But that's not really the case with Svozil. He's so well-rounded, and he's not this good of a prospect because he put up a lot of assists, for instance. I don't look at production very much at all. Like production every year that I keep scouting becomes less and less of a factor in my evaluations. There's still like I still think point totals are useful for as barometers for prospects, but they're so far from the be all end all. And I think that Svozil playing with Bedard pushed Svozil to improve his own game rather than just padding the stats. It was really quite a fundamental shift in how he approaches the game in the 2 years after he played with Connor Bedard. So I wouldn't be overly concerned about his totals just being like pumped up because of Connor Bedard here.
Yeah, it is extremely reassuring. Like I was pretty certain that like all of like every time I watched his game, I was like, I feel like this is not a product of it, but it is reassuring to know that someone who actually does this as a living agrees with me. I find that extremely validating.
All right, so that was Jay Forster and Sebastian High regarding Stanislav Svozil, and that wraps things up for today's show. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe. Leave us a comment letting us know what you want us to talk about next. And if you're listening on your favorite podcasting platform, make sure to make us your first listen of the day. For your second listen of the day, make sure to check out Locked On Sports Today. They've got all your news and updates about what's going on in sports. And make sure to tune in for tomorrow's episode as we continue our prospects coverage throughout the month of October. This has been Hadi Kalikesh with Sebastian High, and we hope you tune in next time.